a conservative YouTube channel. And this is a video, and it's aimed at Trump supporters, and it's aimed at people that are alienated by the synthetic left, which don't blame them for that, right? The left has lost its goddamn mind. I'm with them on that. But I saw this video, and it's called Nixon Forever, glorifying Richard Nixon. And I've written a lot about the Nixon administration. And I think that in a lot of ways, you know, Nixon was removed because he was a barrier to the agenda of some of the forces that were backing the so-called synthetic left even back then. But this video called Nixon Forever is just flat out wrong in so many ways. So many ways. It is a libertarian free market fantasy video that doesn't understand what Nixon did as president, does not understand what the conflict in U.S. society was about, does not understand, you know, what was going on in the so-called left at the time. This video that I'm about to show you is so wrong on so many levels. I thought for tonight, I would take this video apart. I would take apart this video about Richard Nixon, put out aimed at Trump supporters, trying to make Nixon sound good. And we're just going to take it apart here. But before we do that, I will say one thing about Richard Nixon is he had a great campaign theme song. I don't know if you've ever heard it, but Richard Nixon, when he ran for re-election in 1972, he came up with a campaign theme song that was really damn good. You know, it's like one of the best campaign theme songs ever played. So I'm going to put that on right now, just as a fun, you know, cultural reference or whatever. We'll watch Richard Nixon's campaign theme song, and then I am going to rip to shreds this video from the Manhattan Institute, which is a right-wing Republican think tank. I'm going to rip to shreds their video glorifying Richard Nixon because it gets so many things wrong. So here's Richard Nixon's 1972 campaign theme song, Nixon Now.
Reaching out to find the way to make tomorrow a brighter day, making dreams reality. More than ever, Nixon now for you and me. Nixon now, Nixon now. He's made the difference. He's shown us how. Nixon now, Nixon now, more than ever. Nixon now. Listen, America, Nixon now.
Reaching out across the sea, making friends where those used to be. Giving hope to humanity. More than ever, Nixon now for you and me. Nixon now, Nixon now. He's made the difference. He's shown us how. Nixon now, more than ever. Nixon now. Listen, America, Nixon now. Nixon now, Nixon now. He's made the difference. He's shown us how. Nixon now, more than ever. Nixon now, Nixon now, Nixon now. Listen, America, Nixon now.
So there you go. That was pretty good song. Awful president in a lot of ways, but pretty good song. But anyway, so now I'm going to play this video from the Manhattan Institute about Richard Nixon, and we're going to stop it and talk all the way through because the video gets so many things wrong. Gets so many things wrong, this video. I don't know where to begin, but we're just going to go through it point by point because this video trying to sell Richard Nixon to Trump supporters, it's abominable, this video. And it says so many things that are just wrong. I don't know where to start, but I guess we'll just go through it.
in the loop of 1968. The politics of that fateful year have set the patterns of our national life ever since. During the George Floyd riots of
like, no, they haven't, right? The political situation in the United States right now is completely different than in 1968. One of the biggest differences is that in 1968, the U.S. economy was booming. The U.S. economy was in the middle of the post-World War II economic expansion. Ask anyone who was alive during those years about how good the economy was. One could lose their job and walk across the street to a construction site and get a job the same day. Gas stations would hire you the same day on the spot just because they were desperate for someone to work there, right? Now, to work at a gas station, you have to go through like a week-long, a hiring process that takes weeks. I mean, it was like, you have no idea, right? People went to college for free, pretty much, tuition at most of the major universities in the United States was less than $100. I mean, it was ridiculous. So, the USA had just come out of Jim Crow segregation in the South. There was a military draft. It was so different than things are now. Completely different, a completely different political situation. Yes, the country was very polarized, but the polarization had absolutely nothing to do with the polarization now. Completely different. Some of the seeds for what's happening now were planted, but it was completely different, and we'll be getting through that. But that first statement right there, that trying to say that the crisis now and the crisis of 1968 are the same. No, they are not. The crisis now is rooted in the breakdown of the capitalist economy, which was humming along and booming well back in 1968. So even that first thing right there, boom, wrong.
2020, the politics of 1968 reemerged with a vengeance. The Black Panther Party reappeared as the Black Lives Matter movement.
False. The Black Panther Party were Marxist-Leninists that were aligned with revolutionary anti-imperialist governments around the world. Black Lives Matter Incorporated is funded by George Soros and aligned with the U.S. imperialist regime change apparatus. Black Lives Matter is a hashtag that anyone can do. It's just protests that people see on the internet and they go and protest it. The Black Panther Party was a disciplined cadre organization that organized in communities, did free breakfast programs, taught people Marxism, Leninism as their ideology. I'm sorry, Black Lives Matter is a hashtag and a nonprofit run by George Soros. The Black Panthers were a Marxist-Leninist cadre organization of Black nationalist communists that were aligned with third world national liberation movements that were funded by Libya, funded by North Korea. You have no idea what you're talking. Like that right there, right? If they can't understand the difference between being funded by George Soros and being funded by North Korea and Libya, I don't know where to start, but let's continue.
The ideology of the Weather Underground became the ideology of our prestige institutions.
Wait, what? The ideology of the Weather Underground, the Marxist-Leninist group that went on a bombing spree to, that was trying to organize. At first, it was kind of a street fighting organization of like hippies who thought white people were bought off, but they wanted to organize hippies to align with black people. And then they went on a symbolic bombing campaign for a decade. That's what they're teaching in our universities right now. Our universities at this point, the Weathermen called themselves the AmeriCong, right? They considered themselves to be the American division of the Viet Cong, right? They were carrying out bombings to support the Vietnamese National Liberation Front. Our American universities right now are mobilizing nothing but endless support for U.S. regime change operations around the world. The Weathermen were carrying out bombings to oppose U.S. military interventions around the world. Our universities are regime change factories at this point. So you're just wrong on that front. There may be similar contempt for average Americans. The Weathermen thought that average Americans were pigs and had this contempt for the American working class that kind of defined them. And you'll find that a lot of the woke professors kind of teach a similar thing, that average Americans are a bunch of racist scum or something. But other than that, there's no overlap. So that's just wrong too. Black Lives Matter is not the Black Panthers. The American universities that push wokeism are not the Weather Underground.
And the old Marxist-Leninist guerrillas traded in their bandoliers and became diversity and inclusion managers in the Fortune 100.
Yeah, except they believe things that are completely different, right? You are correct that there are many former communists who become academic, woke, privileged politics people, but they changed their beliefs, right? They dropped Marxism, Leninism, and they adopted wokeism, which is an ideology that's crafted by the American ruling class. So you're right that a lot of them did change, right? And even a lot of the so-called Marxist Leninist groups like Freedom Road Socialist Organization and others have started to accommodate this woke crap. But when they became woke, they abandoned Marxism, Leninism, right? The new communist movement of the 1970s was very much an out of the movement to the masses feeling. They intentionally cut their hair short, got jobs in factories, etc. So that's just wrong right there.
The Cultural Revolution that began a half-century ago is now reflected in a deadening sequence of acronyms. CRT, DE...
No, false, right? The teachings of the Black Panthers eventually wanted to form a multinational party. Then they worked with a group of low-income white people called the Young Patriots, who even used the Confederate flag as their symbol. And they called for intercommunalism, forming different revolutionary groups among different races and nationalities to eventually form a multinational communist party. Critical race theory just teaches that white Americans are privileged and bad, and that that's not the same thing at all, right? Critical race theory. If you read William Z. Foster and his History of Black People in America, you read W.E.B. Du Bois. All of that stuff is very, very different than CRT. And the 1619 Project of the New York Times has been ripped to shreds by Marxist scholars because it denies the actual nature of the American Revolution, tries to say the only reason the American Revolution happened was to preserve slavery. You cannot equate genuine revolutionary anti-imperialism with woke liberal crap being put out by the CIA. They're not the same thing. One is a mechanism for stabilizing imperialism and trying to give the impression that the United States has had a woke makeover to justify its regime change wars around the world. And the other was the ideology of the revolutionary movements around the world fighting for national liberation and mobilizing the U.S. working class and the oppressed nationalities of the United States, mobilizing them to fight in solidarity to break apart imperialism here in the homeland. These are two different ideologies serving two distinctly different purposes. They may use the same buzz phrases, they may address similar problems, but they're completely different.
ESG that have increasingly become...
I don't even know what DEI and ESG are. Does anyone know what that is? I know what CRT is. I don't know what DEI and ESG are.
Become our new official morality. Many conservatives have made an uneasy peace with this transvaluation of values, even as the culture around them in many places has collapsed. But this attitude will no longer suffice. It's time.
Now, keep in mind, all this footage that it's showing here, this is from the 1968 Democratic National Convention, when the Democratic Party nominated a pro-Vietnam War candidate, Hubert Humphrey, even though the majority of Democrats were against the Vietnam War. And so young anti-war activists from all over the country were protesting outside the Democratic National Convention in 1968. And the Chicago police went and beat the living hell out of all of them. That's what the footage they're showing there is from. That is of people protesting against the Democratic Party because it nominated a pro-war candidate and, getting the hell beaten out of them by the Chicago police. So I don't know what that has to do with Richard Nixon, but, keep in mind, that's how ignorant all of this is, right? I mean, that we're like less than a minute into this video, and they've said so many things that are wrong, but wait until they start talking about history.
Break the loop of 1968. It's time for counter-revolution. And there's one man, reviled in his time, who can serve as our guide. The 37th President of the United States, Richard Milhous Nixon. The year 1968 was a cataclysm. Rioting, looting, arson, murder.
Yeah, well, the rioting that happened in 1968 was, I believe, April 4th, 1968. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered. The leader of the civil rights movement, the iconic leader of the civil rights movement, who had himself been a pacifist. He went to Memphis, Tennessee to support a group of striking workers. And he got murdered in his hotel, on his hotel balcony. They shot him dead. And the black community was furious that one of their greatest leaders had been killed, even though he was a pacifist, even though he taught nonviolence. And so the country swept with huge uprisings among the black community, pouring out their rage. That's what was going on. So you're just saying rioting, looting, like people just were being crazy and breaking things. You know, the Martin Luther King family has received a settlement from the American government. They sued, basically arguing there was U.S. government complicity in the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And they have received compensation. They've received compensation from the American government. And there are many. I mean, the U.S. government basically declared war on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI, tried to frame, put out a videotape trying to say that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was gay because he was photographed, talking to Bayard Rustin, one of his assistants, while he was sitting in the bathtub, and Bayard Rustin was known to be gay. They leaked sex tapes to the media. They did all kinds of crazy things to discredit Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. They said that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a potential black messiah, and one of the main aims of COINTELPRO was to stop the rise of a black messiah. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered, right? He was killed. And in response to that, the black community rose up. You make it sound like people were just going out there and breaking things or something. This was in response to the murder of somebody who is one of the most beloved figures now in American history. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Has a national holiday in his honor. Republicans now try to claim him, try to claim him as their own at this point. And he got murdered. And it appeared at the time that the American government was very complicit in it, and the black community got mad at it. And you're just making it sound like people were just acting crazy. Come on now.
The New Left's coalition of the white intelligentsia and the black underclass had taken to the streets, promising.
Okay. Their coalition of the white intelligentsia and the black underclass. Well, there's a problem with that, which is that, when you say white intelligentsia, you make it sound like this is all like wealthy college professors and stuff. That's what it is now. Back then, many of the people that were protesting against the Vietnam War that were white young people who were going to protest against the Vietnam War, it was because they were being forcibly conscripted and shot. They could be killed in Vietnam. There were millions of young American men who were 18, 19 years old, who were being forcibly conscripted. They didn't have a choice, either join the military or go to prison, and being sent to Vietnam. And they were coming home in body bags. 58,000 young American men died in Vietnam. And many young men were like, what are we fighting for? Right? What is, stopping Vietnam from adopting communism as their political system? How does that benefit us in any way? So you make it sound like it was all wealthy college professors and stuff. It was a lot of young white people, many of whom were working class, who didn't want to die for a war that they didn't believe in. That's the issue. And many of the people who marched against the Vietnam War were veterans of the war, who saw with their own eyes the horrendous things the American government did in Vietnam. The massacres of civilians, the raping and the torture of Vietnamese women. And they came back and they told the horror stories. They threw their medals over the White House fence. They said, we won't fight another rich man's war. You're making it sound like it was all just rich people. There was a lot of working class young guys from Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Ohio who saw what that war was about and came back and said, this is an abomination, and marched and protested at every one of those big anti-war rallies they had in Washington, D.C. There would be thousands of soldiers in their uniforms, talking about what they saw. So again, just like with the rioting in 1968, the U.S. government had essentially killed, or it appeared that the U.S. government had killed the leader of the civil rights movement. Young men were being sent to Vietnam and killed, and they didn't want to go and die in a war. Like, you make it sound like these are just hoity-toity intellectuals and all of this. You're totally missing the point here.
To overthrow the government and establish a Marxist-Leninist state.
Whoa, hold up. Right? Hold your horses. Hold your horses. It's like every 2 seconds I have to stop this video because it's so wrong. Right?
Government and establish.
What does it say here?
The New Left's coalition of the white intelligentsia and the black underclass had taken to the streets, promising to overthrow the government and establish a Marxist-Leninist state.
Wait, what? I'm sorry, that maybe the Black Panthers, they did want to establish a communist government, and the Students for a Democratic Society organization, sure, they did. But the majority of the people that were rioting after the killing of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. were just mad that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. The majority of the people marching against the Vietnam War were just mad that Americans were coming home in body bags, and they opposed the Vietnam War. And these two faces you've got,
Presidential nomination.
the two faces that they've got on the screen here, right? Here, what are the two faces they've got here? I'll pause it. Eldridge Cleaver, that is a guy who was a leader of the Black Panthers, and then he formed a left adventurist split from the Black Panthers. He split the Black Panthers and led his group to start doing left adventurist terrorism. And Herbert Marcuse, that's a guy who was a CIA-funded intellectual in Germany, right? He was the founder of the Frankfurt School, and he was the founder of the Frankfurt School. He said that the working class is not revolutionary, that only intellectuals will lead the revolution. He broke with standard Marxism-Leninism and was pushing, this kind of postmodernism, and he was being funded by the American government and the CIA in order to do so. So you got two individuals here, one of whom was a Black Panther who led a split from the Black Panthers, fled the United States, and then in 1975 became a born-again evangelical Christian and came back to the United States as a Republican. And the other, who was a CIA-funded intellectual in Germany, who explicitly denounced Marxism and promoted postmodernism. So you're wrong on both of those counts. Those two individuals, okay, continue.
Promising to overthrow the government and establish a Marxist-Leninist state. In his presidential nomination speech that year, Richard Nixon set the stakes and appealed to the revolution of 1776 as the antidote to the chaos of 1968.
My friends, we live in an age of revolution in America and in the world. And to find the answers to our problems, let us turn to a revolution that will never grow old. The world's greatest continuing revolution, the American Revolution.
Yeah. Well, you have to also keep in mind the Weather Underground. They appealed to the American Revolution as well. They waved a "Don't Tread on Me" flag at their rallies. The Communist Party back in those days, they had their bookstores were called the Jefferson bookstores after Thomas Jefferson. Everyone was appealing to the American Revolution back then. If you watch Huey Newton's appearance on the TV program, of William F. Buckley, he begins it by asking William F. Buckley what side he would be on in the American Revolution. The communists were constantly invoking the American Revolution in these days. So that's just completely wrong as well.
Nixon called on the silent majority, the forgotten Americans, the non-shouters, the non-demonstrators, to rally behind his counter-revolution. And he promised to be their champion against the bureaucracy, against the chaos.
Yeah, that part here, this is where the video just blatantly misrepresents the facts. The bureaucracy of the American government vastly expanded under Nixon's leadership. We'll get to that later, but that's why this video is so wrong. It completely misrepresents Nixon's economic policies.
Against the corruption. Over the next 4 years, this coalition would grow from a narrow victory in 1968 to a 49-state landslide in 1972, the greatest political triumph of the post-war era. Nixon had mobilized the middle class into a political force, and he had a vision for reversing an era of decline much like our own.
It's true that he talked of a silent majority. It's true that he appealed to white middle-class people who were alienated by the protests and all of that. That's absolutely true, right? That's correct. But the idea that he was rallying them against government bureaucracy and all of that, that's just not factually accurate.
The first element of Nixon's counter-revolution was the campaign to reestablish law and order. As a candidate, Nixon pledged strength against the forces of crime and violence. His campaign advertisements played to the anxieties of the age.
It is time for an honest look at the problem of order in the United States. Dissent is a necessary ingredient of change. But in a system of government that provides for peaceful change, there is no cause that justifies resort to violence.
As President Nixon delivered, he instructed his FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, to launch a sophisticated campaign to infiltrate, disrupt, and dismantle the radical organizations that threatened violent revolution against the state.
Okay, so first of all, the FBI was already doing that, right? The COINTELPRO program started in the 1950s, and that Ramsey Clark, who was the U.S. Attorney General under Lyndon Johnson, was trying to some degree or other, hold back the FBI, and he was unable to do so. And Richard Nixon, when he got in, he said he fired Ramsey Clark, and then the FBI escalated its campaign against the Black Panther Party, and it engaged in all kinds of illegal activities. Fred Hampton was murdered. Mark Clark was murdered. All kinds of, you read what was done. People were sent into the Black Panther Party to incite people to murder each other. Criminal organizations were used against the Black Panther Party to assassinate Black Panthers. The FBI incited the US organization, United Slaves, the guy who invented Kwanzaa, to murder Black Panthers. It was like what the U.S. government did to suppress the Black Panthers. This video makes it sound like it was some kind of heroic thing. It was all kinds of murder and framing people up and sending them to prison for crimes they didn't commit. It was a vast program of brutal political repression. The FBI during this time, they had a guy you can read about, Tony the Traveler, right? Is it Tony the Traveler or Tommy the Traveler? Tony the Traveler, right? Read about this, right? Tony the Traveler, right? And this is, Tommy the Traveler. It's Tommy the Traveler, right? Tommy the Traveler. You can read all about it. Google Tommy the Traveler, FBI COINTELPRO. They had an FBI agent go around to college campuses and pretend to be a national leader of Students for a Democratic Society and instruct all the local people about how to make bombs. And he would go up, innocent college kids who were interested in communism or whatever. This guy would show up and he'd be really cool and he'd be really smart and he would teach them all how to make bombs. And then they would all be arrested for trying to make bombs. And hundreds of people were entrapped by the FBI during this program. Hundreds of revolutionary people were entrapped by an FBI agent who showed up and entrapped them into, making explosives. So that was completely illegal. Read about Tommy the Traveler, completely illegal. It was just completely unbelievable. So he's making it sound like the FBI programs. Go and read the COINTELPRO papers by Jim Vander Wall and Ward Churchill. They did so many illegal things. There were all kinds of people that it was horrendous what was done.
Including the Black Panther Party, the Black Liberation Army, the Weather Underground, and the Communist Party USA.
And the other thing is the Communist Party USA at this point was not advocating anything other than supporting the Democratic Party, peaceful transition to socialism, right? The Black Panthers were a Marxist-Leninist group. The Black Liberation Army was a left adventurist split from the Black Panthers. The Weather Underground was, a group of ultra-left kind of hippies that did a bombing campaign. Communist Party USA at this point was campaigning for the Democrats, and they didn't get wiped out either. This video says they got wiped out. They didn't get wiped out. They just kept campaigning for the Democrats. Angela Davis, this was, kind of the heyday. This was a time when they actually had a lot of support. Angela Davis was a household name. They didn't get wiped out. Communist Party was heavily infiltrated by the FBI and manipulated into not being a revolutionary organization. They did not get wiped out. It's like, I look at this and it's like one of these, it's like, what was it? What was that thing on Sesame Street back in the day? One of these three is not like the other one. Yeah, it's like one of these, Black Marxist-Leninist group, ultra-left adventurous terrorist group, group that goes around campaigning for the Democrats. Putting these four groups together is just the height of ignorance, right?
Although some of Hoover's actions went beyond the rule of law.
No shit. Killing people, murdering Fred Hampton in his bed with 200 bullets, murdering Mark Clark, framing up and sending all kinds of innocent people to jail, sending provocateurs like Tommy the Traveler to college campuses to frame up innocent kids. Yeah, went a little bit beyond the rule of law. Geronimo Pratt sat in federal prison for years for a crime the FBI knew he didn't commit. I mean, look at the details of Geronimo Pratt and his frame up. I mean, my goodness. My goodness.
By the end of Nixon's first term, the administration had successfully dismantled most of the subversive organizations, and many of their leaders were on the run, in prison, or in the ground. As the neo-Marxist philosopher.
And that's not true either. I mean, like I said, the Communist Party existed. I mean, Eldridge Cleaver fled the country after his group, the Black Liberation Army, or the Black Panther, it was, for a while they talked about Black Panther Party Newton, Black Panther Party Cleaver. But most of the revolutionary activists at that time were in the United States. They weren't on the run. That's false.
Philosopher Herbert Marcuse wrote in 19.
Yeah, Herbert Marcuse was a CIA-funded postmodernist, anti-communist, anti-Marxist Leninist. Okay, so I mean, Herbert Marcuse was being funded covertly by the American government. You do understand that, right? Right. Herbert Marcuse, he was pushing postmodernism and one-dimensional man. He was not pushing Marxism, Leninism.
1972, the Nixon administration has strengthened the counter-revolutionary organization of society in all directions. The Black Panther Party has been systematically chased down before it disintegrated in internal conflicts. A vast army of undercover agents is spread over the entire country and through all branches of society.
And how is that a good thing? That in a country where we're supposed to have democracy, we're supposed to be able to believe in whatever system we want, that a group of black people says that they want to have, black nationalism and communism. The group of Americans believe in Marxism. They form the Communist Party. And the American government forms a vast undercover army of agents to suppress them and frame them up and send them to prison and murder them. How is that a good thing? If you believe in democracy, if you believe in democracy and the rule of the people, how does the FBI have the right to actively dismantle black revolutionary groups, socialist groups? If you believe in democracy, right? At this point, Trumpers are very angry about the fact that the FBI rigged the election against Donald Trump by suppressing the Hunter Biden laptop story. What if the FBI was actively breaking apart Donald Trump supporter organizations, which it kind of is doing at this point? I mean, if anything, Trumpers should be sympathetic to the Black Panthers and sympathetic to the anti-war movement, because what is being done to them right now, right, with the frame up, the entrapment, luring them into the Capitol so they could be, arrested and charged with that, throwing all kinds of ridiculous charges at Donald Trump to keep him off the ballot. What was being done back then to black revolutionaries and to communists is now being done to Trump supporters. So this whole video this is ridiculous. Did Trump supporters not notice that the same FBI that's coming after them because they challenge the mainstream of U.S. imperialism and what U.S. imperialism wants to do is also the same FBI that went after these black revolutionaries? Trump supporters are talking about freedom of speech and government agencies not being blatantly partisan. That's what this is.
The revolution, it seemed, was finished. For Nixon, however, law and order was only the beginning. By the end of his first term, frustrated by the permanent administration in Washington, Nixon had conceived of his most important task, leading a counter-revolution against the state bureaucracy.
False. 1969, the U.S. economy began to decline, and Richard Nixon kicked Milton Friedman out of the White House. Milton Friedman, the free market libertarian economist, kicked him out of the White House. And he said, we're all Keynesians now. And he implemented his famous Nixon shocks. He took the USA off the gold standard. He implemented a wage and price freeze to curb inflation. Nixon also advocated a guaranteed minimum income for all citizens. And in 1972, during his presidential election, that was one of his planks when he was running for being reelected, was that all citizens of the United States would get a guaranteed income from the government. That is not libertarianism. That is not draining the swamp. That's not privatizing everything.
The idea that a bureaucratic elite in Washington knows best what is best for people everywhere, and that you cannot trust local governments, is really a contention that you cannot trust people to govern themselves. This notion is completely foreign to the American experience.
To combat this, Nixon proposed a new American Revolution, in which the government would be put back into check and power would be returned to the people. As the New York Times noted, Nixon wanted to advance an ideological grand design that would reverse the progression of the New Deal and the Great Society, abolishing the federal programs that threatened to impose the elite consensus on the common citizen.
Yeah, except Richard Nixon also created the Environmental Protection Agency. He created the Office of Workplace Health and Safety, the administration of the Office of the Occupational Health and Safety Administration, OSHA. Nixon expanded the welfare state and expanded government programs and welfare. Nixon enacted the first affirmative action policies in higher. It's like Nixon's administration greatly expanded government bureaucracy. He created the EPA. He created OSHA. Some things are true and some things are not. And like, he may have made a lot of ideologically conservative statements, but under Nixon's leadership, the bureaucracy of the American government greatly expanded.
Famous enemies list was a crude proxy for the type of men who wanted to use the power of the state to re-engineer society in their image. As Nixon told Henry Kissinger in the Oval Office,
The press is the enemy. The establishment is the enemy. The professors are the enemy. Write that in the blackboard 100 times and never forget it.
and in a certain sense, Nixon was right. He realized that in order to have a chance at restoring the principle of self-government, conservatives needed to overthrow the establishment and tame the bureaucracy that desired to manage society from above.
No, Nixon greatly expanded the bureaucracy. EPA, OSHA, lowering the voting age to 18. I'm sorry, some things are true and some things are not. Now, Richard Nixon was there were aspects of his presidency that were anti-establishment right, and that's why he was removed, and I agree with that. But this idea that he shrunk the bureaucracy, he was some kind of libertarian, again, late into his presidency, in his State of the Union speech, he called for every family with children to receive an automatic subsidy from the government of thousands of dollars. Like, that's just not true. Richard Nixon was not a free marketeer. He was not.
He had formulated a plan for achieving this, his new American Revolution, breaking up the federal bureaucracy.
False. How can they say this? He expanded the federal bureaucracy. You can't say that he broke up the federal bureaucracy when he expanded it. He created a whole new wings of it. You just can't. You just say this over and over and over again, ignoring the facts.
Defunding left-wing ideological programs.
What left-wing ideological programs? What left-wing ideological programs existed in 1968? There was no gender studies at universities back then. There was no black studies at universities back then. There was no queer studies at university. What ideological left-wing programs? What ideological left-wing programs existed back then? What are you talking about? Like there was no such thing. The United States had just had McCarthyism. Communism was the enemy. They didn't start setting up ideological left-wing programs for a really long time. What in 1968, there were zero black studies departments at American public universities in those days. There were zero queer studies, zero women's studies departments, ideological left-wing programs. He's just making stuff up here. Right? He's trying to project modern right-wing conservatism onto Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was a conservative in many ways, and he was ousted by the establishment, and we'll get to that. But he didn't shrink the bureaucracy of the government at all. He greatly expanded it, number one. And number two, there were no ideological... this is just silly.
And sending taxpayer dollars and decision-making power back to the states. As Nixon wrote in his diary just after his re-election, this is going to be quite a shock to the establishment, but it is the only way, and probably the last time, that we can get government under control before it gets so big that it submerges the individual completely and destroys the dynamism which makes the American system what it is.
I mean, again, you're pointing to ideological, broad sweeping conservative statements, but the actual facts of what the Nixon administration did was vastly expand government bureaucracy. That is just a fact.
Tragically, Nixon never achieved his counter-revolution.
No shit. He achieved exactly the opposite of this.
His political career, which began in the California desert and ended in the White House, was cut short by the Watergate scandal and his subsequent resignation.
But what happened right after Richard Nixon resigned? What happened? Who replaced Richard Nixon? Gerald Ford. And what did Gerald Ford immediately do? Gerald Ford brought Alan Greenspan to the White House, and free market policies and austerity escalated under Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford brought Alan Greenspan to the government. Gerald Ford brought Milton Friedman back. Gerald Ford also brought us Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, and neoliberalism and privatizations escalated under Ford. Richard Nixon, part of the reason he was gotten rid of was, despite his conservatism, he had this right-wing populist element to him. He was somewhat of an economic nationalist, right? He was not into all the free market policies. After Nixon was removed, neoliberal economics greatly expanded. You make it sound like after Nixon was removed, all of a sudden, the bureaucracy was expanding. No, the neoliberal austerity and the cuts in government spending and the deregulation all escalated after Nixon left. So this is just wrong.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
These are the images of Richard Nixon seared into the minds of many Americans. His lonely resignation speech, his last meal in the White House, his final departure on the presidential helicopter. But over the years, another story has emerged that challenges the conventional wisdom. Nixon was not the sole author of his fate, but the victim of a bureaucratic coup.
That's true, but why was it carried out?
Harper's editor Jim Hogan, former Nixon aide Jeff Shepard, and other researchers have uncovered tens of thousands of declassified documents that reveal the black hand of the state as a prime mover in Nixon's demise.
Yes, he was removed by people who wanted more privatizations and more austerity and more cutbacks and more deregulation.
As Claremont scholar John Marini has long argued, the Watergate scandal was, at the deepest level, a war between the democratically elected president and the permanent state.
Yes, the permanent state appointed by the Rockefeller think tanks and the U.S. intelligence agencies in alliance with the press, who were pushing deregulation, who were pushing neoliberalism, who eventually brought about the Trilateral Commission and brought Paul Volcker into the head of the Federal Reserve under Carter at the end of the decade. That, yes, he was ousted. Absolutely. There was a liberal conspiracy to get rid of Richard Nixon because he was a right-wing populist. He was an economic nationalist, and he was expanding the government bureaucracy in order to stabilize society. I mean, he passed all kinds of government regulations, environmental laws, workplace protections. He pardoned Jimmy Hoffa, the leader of the Teamsters, and he let the Teamster leader out of jail. I'm sorry, but he established, he went to China and made friends with Mao. He had détente with the Soviet Union. He was friends with Brezhnev, and he was de-escalating the arms race, and he had détente with both China and the Soviet Union. I'm sorry, but this just doesn't fit your narrative here at all.
At the time of Nixon's re-election in 1972, he posed the greatest danger to the authority of the bureaucracy and the administrative state, Marini wrote.
Yes, they wanted to move ahead with privatizations, deregulation, cutbacks. They wanted to get rid of union jobs. They wanted to deregulate and gut social spending and social programs. And Richard Nixon, in order to keep his power, he had to keep Archie Bunker on his side, right? There was a TV program during the Nixon years called All in the Family. And it was a show kind of mocking Nixon supporters. And the character, the right-wing racist dad on the show, was a guy named Archie Bunker. And Archie Bunker, was a hard hat. He was a labor union guy. And Nixon supporters tended to be labor union guys, hard hats, conservative right-wing dads. And Richard Nixon was not willing to destroy those people's jobs and incomes. He knew that if he was going to be able to carry out his kind of Bonapartist authoritarian rule, he was going to have to keep the loyalty of some sections of the middle class. And so even though he was racist and vicious to the Black Panthers and vicious to the student movement, he pardoned Jimmy Hoffa. He took care of the Teamsters Union. He kicked Milton Friedman out of the White House and said, we're all Keynesians now. He called for a guaranteed minimum income. He expanded the government bureaucracy, the EPA, the Office of Workplace Health and Safety. I mean, this is, sorry, Nixon was not an advocate of neoliberal economics.
Rights. And consequently, he had to be cut down. Nixon had tried to drain the swamp, but the swamp won.
Yeah, but they didn't win by stopping austerity. The swamp wanted austerity. It wanted cuts in government spending. It wanted, gutting the welfare state. It wanted an end to the